Joining us. We're really excited to try out our new studio and have offer just some of our services. And purpose of this meeting today is to just really dive into motivation and see what your motivation mindset is, what your beliefs have been in the past, and if we can bring some light to what the science behind motivation is.
Sure. Thank you. So one of the things we want to start with is how we regard motivation. And what I want to do is provide some perspective and framework to challenge maybe how we've been using that language in the past. If you've seen some of my posts and I make reference to junk food motivation, I'll get to that in a little bit, and hopefully that will clarify things. But if you think about it in and of yourself, how do we historically talk about motivation? And really, most of the time, it's in a very binary, dualistic framework that people are either intrinsically motivated, which that's where we want to be, right? Or extrinsically motivated. And my concern with this and the problem with this is that we talk so much about motivation in the workplace and in our lives. Yet when we work with people in organizations, we can't motivate them, right? So motivation is really, truly an internal state that we can cultivate and nurture that. So as it relates to intrinsic motivation, leaders could cultivate and nurture that, and we'll get into how that occurs in a little bit. But the other side of it is extrinsic motivation, right? And so oftentimes you hear people talk about, well, only if we paid more, or if we had better benefits, or more time off, or more flexible work environments. And those are all external concepts, and they have their time and their place. But what I'm ultimately concerned about is how are we leading other people to be optimally motivated in the workplace? And unfortunately, most of us, when we're hired into whether a reporting line or even the leader of the organization, we have very little discretion over the concept of extrinsic motivation and rewards, right? So incentives, we talk about a lot, and we always want more money, stuff, things like that, which makes a lot of sense. But we're not often able to broker those or provide bonuses routinely or give significant pay bumps. So when I think about a lot of what my clients are working through right now, their hands are tied with respect to compensation. And as markets become more expensive, we all want to increase that level of compensation to be more competitive, but many people have their hands tied. So what I'm proposing is that we get away from our very dualistic perspective on motivation. And I'll actually get into that more in session 2, on part 2 of this, on another day. But I want to start a little bit more foundational and talk about what motivation essentially is. And I think, as I mentioned, the junk food motivation stuff, so there are frameworks out there people are trying to promote as motivators for staff. There are assessments that talk about motivators or motivation for staff. And I really push back on that, because now we're stretching this term motivation to cover a wide variety of things, an increasingly wide variety of things. And I think as leaders and as people that are concerned with people, we're only starting to look at these as band-aids or superficial addresses. And let me give you an example. So I love potato chips. They are, my junk food of choice. Doritos, any of those. I love Canadian. Them. Yeah, all dressed. Yes, Canadian. For the Canadians in the audience. But, one could argue that it's food, right? It's calories. But are those good calories for us? Right? No, they're kind of junk foody calories. I'm better off having something more whole and natural than those. I think about a lot of these concepts of motivation people are pushing out in the marketplace that they're trying to sell, like I said, whether it's through tools, assessments, frameworks, and they are proposing that they're putting out these things that are going to fix people or improve their quality of work. And I'm not saying that they're wrong and they won't fix people. What I'm making a request for is that we get back to a little bit more of a foundational belief and understanding of what motivation really is. And as far as I'm concerned, those things aren't really directly tied to motivation. And what I want to do is encourage us to maintain the integrity of the term and develop alternative terms if we need. So if you think back to remember when you were teaching, we would talk about student learning styles, things like that. You remember that? And a lot of you say, hey, I'm auditory or I'm visual, I'm kinesthetic learner. That's my learning style. But what we know is that we all possess all of those styles. We draw upon them differently at different points in time, but they're merely preferences that we go to and we turn to. So if I'm more kinesthetic, which I really am, I'm a kinesthetic person, that's my preference. That's where I really shine, and that's where I really enjoy doing things. But I could still learn through reading. I could still learn through listening, right? And I think about the junk food motivation stuff as being very much akin to that. And what my proposal is that we shift the language from motivation and those frameworks and tools to styles or preferences, right? Because even some of the tools we use ourselves that we work with, they propose that they're motivators or they're grounded motives, and I think of it more, and I think it's more appropriate to call them styles or preferences, or even values. Like someone might value being more collaborative in nature, but that doesn't mean that they can't be commanding. Of course they can. They will be. They might default to collaborative, but one over the other isn't really, truly better than the other. It just aligns more with the person based on what they prefer. So in my argument, I'd love to get away from talking about those superficial things as it relates to motivation and get deeper into what motivation really is. So I take a needs-based approach to motivation, and we do in our firm, and that's how we work with people. We try to keep the language strict around this, that people become more optimally motivated when their needs are fulfilled. And what can we turn to look at that helps demonstrate this to us? If we go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we look at what's the foundational level there, it's a physiological need for warmth, for food, for reproduction, for things like that. And then the next one up is a safety need, which is housing, security, and nourishment, things like that. And so what I argue is that we are doing leaders a disservice when we talk about motivation on those other terms about whether or not this person's motivated according to their strength, or whether or not they're motivated because they're according to their more collaborative style. Well, you can spend all the money you want on these frameworks and these solutions, but if that person is homeless, or if that person can't provide for their family at the level they want, or even if no longer the compensation is realistic for them, then how are they ever going to prosper on these other more superficial elements? Some people might, but I don't believe it's sustainable. So what I want to, like I said, encourage us is get back to motivation as it's based on people's needs. And then once we fulfill those basic two levels of needs, then we move into psychological needs. And that's what Maslow referred to it as. But specifically, there's been a body of research that we follow that's been significant over time, and it's been in its development, and it's called self-determination theory, and it's really built upon a number of micro theories, but one of the foundational concepts of it is what drives us in terms of how do we help people perform better, live a more rich life, be optimally motivated. And can we pull up our dashboard for the image now? So what you see on the screen there is one of our Black River tools. And I should just mention that I'm not going to talk for an hour. I'm going to talk probably for another 15 minutes or so.
And put questions in here too, as you see fit, and I can ask Rob what comes up.
Exactly. So we want this to be a little bit more about you. We'll provide a little bit of education base and then come back to what questions do you have as it relates to this. And so the dashboard, one of the things we do is we try to demystify the concepts that relate to managing people in organizations. So we've developed a number of images over the years to help explain and operationalize things such as, so if you look at the dashboard on the right side, it says CAR, that's car. That's what we're going to talk about today. That looks at what's called basic psychological needs, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then you go over to the speedometer. That's a research-based framework that relates to actually more refined concepts of motivation. And that's what we're going to cover in our part two the next time we meet. And the reason why that one is so important is that just as I led that we talk about things as intrinsic and extrinsic, but we really can't use that. We can't manage that. But it's the other items that are in the orange and the yellow that's where we exist as peers, as leaders, things like that. And that has a direct impact on people's intrinsic levels of motivation.
Yeah. I just wanted to add that as you're thinking about this and we're thinking about leading others, I want you to think about your own levels of motivation too, as he talks about things, because we are talking about becoming intrinsically motivated ourselves. And oftentimes when we've been through stress or burnout and things like that, we find ourselves kind of lagging on the motivation spectrum. And so as you're watching this and you're listening, don't just think about it from a leading others perspective, but of leading yourself, self-leadership.
Wonderful. Thank you. The last two items on the dashboard, alignment that relates to culture and trust. And we have some more language that goes deeper into that. We'll talk about that on a different day, as well as emotions and the role emotions play in our decisions and our actions.
And our motivation.
And our motivation, how emotions are tied to that. Sometimes we have research to demonstrate that it's not 100% one leads to the other. So as it relates to car, those are the basic psychological needs. And the basic premise of that is that if we are deficient in either the C, the A, or the R, we are not going to be able to be or experience optimal levels of motivation or high quality motivation, intrinsic motivation. That's what we really mean when we're talking about there.
The extrinsic would be like the carrots and the sticks.
Exactly.
Punishment and rewards. So we're trying to stay away from those because those aren't sustainable.
Yeah. And this is stacked this way, right? Because if we jumped right into the dial of the speedometer, we wouldn't understand some of the science that informs how and why we behave the way we do. And so this is why that car concept is extremely important. And so the elements of car, and like I said, this has been researched for actually we're well over 40 years now on these concepts. These are three basic psychological needs that people must possess to be optimally motivated. And actually, as Angie mentioned, think about your own self. As I talk through the different categories, consider where you are as it relates to the C, as it relates to the A, as it relates to the R, and not just your work life, but your personal life, and maybe even your home life, even if those are separate, right? Because a deficiency in one of those three categories is going to have an effect on your quality of intrinsic motivation. Mm-hmm. So let's get started. So
I wanted to add one more thing.
Yes.
Quick. I think about us going on a journey here. Our leadership, our life is a journey. And if you remember when you got your driver's license or you had a kid who got their driver's license, one of the first things they have to do is they have to walk around the car and they have to inspect the car to see, like, if everything's in alignment and if everything's working correctly before they get in the car. That's part of it. So think about yourself and then think about others checking their car.
Perfect. And we are going to end with the check your car concept of how we work with clients and individuals to do that to help others. But I don't think there's any better place to start than getting this recorded and on tape about the concept of competency and the lack thereof of our son who's a new driver, right? So the C in car refers to competency. And competency is the ability to do a task, not a job necessarily. We'll talk about that in a minute. A task consistently, correctly. And I make a difference between task versus job because we think of ourselves, if we're good in our job, that we're competent in our job. But if you ever stop and review your job description after you've been in that position for a number of years, there's things that you actually don't really do or you don't enjoy.
And you're not really good at it.
Yeah.
Or you don't do it consistently well.
Yeah, you don't want me to run the budgets. It's not fun for me. And so I'm not competent in that area. Even though I'm good in my job, it's of lesser priority, of lesser importance to me, right? Mm-hmm. So as we think about the concept of competence, so let me give an example. And we have some tenets at Black River. And one of them is enthusiasm does not equal competence. And that's an important concept to keep in mind. Enthusiasm does not equal competence. And we manage this poorly quite frequently. And think about it this way. If you have a new employee, their job description checks, they check all the boxes on the job description. They meet the minimums. They actually meet the preferred. But day one in the organization, are they competent? No, they're not. They might be competent in their craft, but they're not necessarily competent in the culture. They're not necessarily competent in the computer systems or the software. They're not competent among those staff. They don't know about the unwritten policies or the unspoken rules, things like that. And so competence is a tricky thing that we give people too much of the benefit of the doubt, mainly because we're afraid to micromanage them because we don't like to be micromanaged. And as a result, we actually unintentionally alienate them to some extent. We set them loose, we give them the keys to their office, and we kind of let them figure it out on their own. And with every group we work with, we ask them, did you get leadership onboarding? Did you get leadership training? And the vast majority of people say, no, I was an expert at my craft, so I had high competence as a widget maker. But then I was promoted into this role and I'm no longer competent as a leader. That's why we are in these workshops and retreats and series.
Or they're now a manager of 25 people.
Right.
And they've got no leadership skills to help them, to support them in that role.
Exactly. Let's talk about another way we've seen competence and enthusiasm does not equal competence. So our son loves cars. He's a newly minted driver. So be careful out there. Be aware he's on the road. But, according to him, he's an expert in driving. He wins all the races on his video games. And despite what we have to say, as parents know nothing. So anyways, we got a call one night and something happened and somehow he ran the car into a concrete post in a parking lot that was empty. So anyways, it was great fuel for us that he'll never live down, clearly. That to have this conversation a little further about just because you think you're great, because you think you're an expert at something, it doesn't mean you are. And so when we talk about this, so one of the things I want you to consider is, of all things in your life, what's your level of competence as it relates to all those things? And I'm sure you have some things that you're really good at. And then there's other things, like maybe you're picking up guitar, so you have no competence and you're trying to learn it because it's fun.
Or Spanish.
Yeah, there's all these things going on. But so competence is the first part of this. The second one is something I think it's one of the highly touted things around by trainers and consultants, but it's also a dangerous space to be in, and that's autonomy. And what we often hear is like, you want more engagement, you want your people to rise up, give them more autonomy. And autonomy is a slippery slope because it could also become neglect, a benign level of neglect, right? And actually, there's research to show that too much autonomy without proper frameworks and supervision leads to really disastrous situations, mega failures that cost people their lives. And so, anytime you bring someone in, they say, you just need to give them more autonomy. Take that with a grain of salt, because there's another side of that is actually there's a slippery slope to that. And if you're not managing the autonomy properly, it could come and bite you in the butt. But autonomy is important. And it's especially important if you're already competent. So if you're in your job, you've been there for a number of years, you have all the skills and the abilities, then you should be cut loose and empowered and supported, right? It's the opposite of micromanagement. This is the problem we have with micromanagement, is that people are competent and people aren't getting the autonomy. And that has a direct drain on motivation. And so autonomy is a tricky factor there, but it's an extremely important factor. And in future session, I'll actually make the argument for actually a good quality of micromanagement that's necessary based on the concept of competence and autonomy. But we don't need to talk about that today unless people want to talk about it in terms of questions. And speaking of which, go ahead and submit questions. I don't want to talk the whole time. Happy to answer questions.
I do have one comment, which is good, from Ron. He says, I distinguish motivation and inspiration. Inspiration is great, but as a regular diet, it functions a lot like your junk food motivation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always find it interesting, split hairs with presenters and trainers at times because they say they're a motivational speaker. And I Ron, correct me if I'm not in line with you, but I think of most of those speakers are more inspirational. They make you feel good. They give you some ideas because in the end, you are the person that's in charge of your own motivation. And that's part of the reason why I think we need to refine the term motivation and be mindful of that, is because we just throw it out there too much.
Well, we do have a van and live down by the river, so I think we qualify.
Yeah. Yeah. We're like Matt Foley on Saturday Night Live in a van down by the river at times.
Yes.
Right? So yeah, send some more questions, please. So the last item is R. It's relatedness. And if you've noticed over the last 2-3 years, as we went into COVID and are working our way out of it, the concept of relatedness is really rising to the surface. And another way to think about it is connection, right? And so prior to COVID, loneliness was the pandemic at that time.
And actually, it still
is. We haven't made any headway in it, and it's actually found to be more detrimental to your health than like alcohol and cigarettes combined. And so the concept of connection or relatedness is super important here, but it's also really tricky. So people need to be connected to others, despite how much I might be. I'm a super introvert, and I like my alone time. I still need it. I still need that connection to optimally function,
Mm-hmm.
and it's important as I try to find balance in my life. The tricky thing is when we bring this into our home lives and our work lives, and how does that manifest? So I'm going to ask you to move into kind of a leadership thought role right now with your thoughts. So if we're trying to cultivate competence with people, we're giving them the training they need, we're providing them the support, the coaching, one-on-ones, removing barriers, and accountability. Accountability is an important part of competence, right? Autonomy, the same thing. We're monitoring our engagement with people, and we are giving them space as they need space, but we're also holding on just a little bit so that they know that they have the support they need. They don't feel isolated. Right? So what do we do with relatedness? Do we have more staff parties? Do we have more business parties, business lunches, things like that? How do we manage this? Because if Rob's saying that relatedness is really important in the workplace, how do I integrate that in my team? And the challenge is, it's not that simple.
You can't just have a pizza party for
right.
everyone. Yeah.
Well, if you think about people in recognition, right? Mm-hmm. You might want public praise. I want private praise. Someone else wants no praise. We all have our preferences as it relates to these things. Mm-hmm. So the same thing relates to relatedness. People have their preferences, but their preferences are a little bit more complicated than just, I prefer this. It's at a little bit more of a subconscious level related to what's going on in their life. And so we could do happy hour every Fridays as a group and make it optional for people. I would never require mandatory fun time with people as a mechanism to build relatedness. You do that for some other things you want to build. But, not expect people to come to the happy hour, but invite everyone and say, hey, this open invitation exists. And we know these people. We have these people in our lives. Some of us are these people. We have these people on our staff that they have enough going on in their life. They don't need to hang out with people at work. What's more important is that people create lasting relationships and connections with and trust with one or two people at work to build those relationships. But overall, we can't handle everyone the same way. So I bring that up because it suggests, then what do we do about this? Are we totally, do we have no control over this? And my thought and my response is, we don't have control over what's going on in other people's lives, but we can continue to invite them to be a part of the greater group or our own lives. And so we continue to invite John, Lisa, Tammy, Dennis, all these people to happy hour on Fridays. And if they want to come, they come. The challenge is when we choose not to invite, say, Dennis, because Dennis has never attended and thought, well, he's not interested. Well, who knows what's going on in Dennis's personal and professional life that relates to relatedness? And maybe he does need someone. Maybe he needs some friend time. Maybe he needs some connection with some guys, or whatever it is that fills him up and moves him. Because what happens, it's just like our emotions. We don't have work emotions and then home emotions. They blur together, and we carry them from one environment to the other. The same thing happens with respect to like relatedness, is that we might experience something very fulfilling that fills our bucket for both home and work, but it could also just disappear, such as relationships that people have together or family challenges, things like that, that then chase them into the workplace. That now, if we get back to our more foundational needs, are their foundational, those Maslow basic needs being fulfilled? And if those are, then how are we doing with their psychological needs, right? The last thing I want to say, I want to do a check the car. Anything? Do you have anything to add to all this?
Yeah, it's just super important to keep in mind that people do have that work car, or if they're a student or a worker, they have their one at work or at school, and then they have the home one. So as we start to think about checking the car for yourself and for the student or for the employee, just think about, what's going on in their life. And maybe you could give an explanation of working with an executive director. I'm thinking of as how we navigated that.
Sure. I do want to add, as it works with students, what's tricky is that, students give up autonomy to come to college, right? And so some people might be wrestling with, well, how do I give my students more autonomy? And there's ways to do that. There's mechanisms to do that. But one of the things to remember, though, is that, say higher education, for an example, or high school, it's a compliance game. You have to fulfill the steps to move forward. So there's an element of diminished autonomy there.
However, they did choose to go there. And if they
right.
So that's another piece.
Yep.
They chose to do if they chose to go to school to do whatever it is they do, it will improve, their motivation will go up. But if it's been imposed
that's another
by a
thing.
parent, like you'll be doing law school or you're going to school for this, and what they really wanted to do was be a writer, you're going to see it won't be sustainable.
Yeah, and that relates a lot to the dial that we're looking at beside the car model. Okay, so this is an example of how motivation kind of transcends from home to work and vice versa. So I had a person reach out to me and said, I don't know what to do about this employee. And this is an opportunity, especially if you're in a leadership role, to kind of maybe join me with your mindset here, that I don't know what to do with Gloria. Gloria is not performing at the level we need her to perform. And I don't know what to do. And so I start by asking some questions, because what we want to do is we want to determine essentially what's Gloria's car, which are competence, autonomy, and relatedness, right? And so I started to ask questions, how long has Gloria been with the organization? Over 2 years. Oh, okay, good to know. Okay, so that makes sense. So now I'm thinking, wait, let's check that C. So in those 2 years, has Gloria been competent? And the person said, yeah, actually, quick learner, picked it up, was excellent, and then all of a sudden it just dropped right off. So that gives me some information about her, because what that tells me is that she doesn't need work, essentially job craft or work role remediation necessarily, that she knows how to enter the information correctly. She knows how to process the reports properly. She knows how to do these things. So she didn't become incompetent in the workplace, right? She's just, there's some other things going on. So I said, well, let's check the autonomy. What's Gloria's state of autonomy? And so what's changed? New leaders, new staff, what does that look like? So they walk me through the situation. No changes, essentially. She still has essentially the same level of autonomy as she did when she was competent and flourishing. So let's talk about relatedness, the next thing. And they really pair together nicely, autonomy and relatedness. So same thing. What's her relationship like with respect to her staff, leaders, people that are below her, the people she's working with? And the report back to me was there's no concerns, there's no problems.
No new boss, nothing.
No new boss. The only problem is that she's not doing her work, so she's incompetent. And it's like, no, she's not incompetent. She has the competence. There's something else getting in the way. So, if you take what I mentioned earlier, junk food motivation, well, we might look at what are the ways to engage her, or some other tools that talk about motives and strengths and things like that. And we start using those. Like maybe she's in the wrong position. We need to put her into a position where she's more aligned with her interests. That's still not going to solve the problem. and I'll explain that in a moment, why you'll see this. That's just merely a distraction. That's an expense to the organization. In fact, many organizations are too rigid to utilize a lot of those frameworks so that they can't really adapt that work environment to make it more aligned with that person's strengths or interests. So I said, well, we checked her car at work, and this is the language we use. Let's check the car at home. And that's what I encourage my clients, the CEOs, the presidents I work with, people like that, when they're trying to troubleshoot something. This is where we start, because these are more foundational, they're basic psychological needs. If these aren't in check, optimal levels of motivation cannot occur. And so we need to get a handle on this. So the CEO responds and says, I don't know what's going on in the home life. And I said, well, why don't you ask? Why don't you look into that and discuss that with her? And she said, no, I don't do that. I'm not interested in, bridging that work and professional and personal life. That's separate for those people. I said, it is essentially separate. We live in two different places, right? We live mainly in the job, and then we go home to sleep and spend time with loved ones. But what's ultimately happening here is what's occurring in this other environment, this other domain, we'll call it, that's following them to work, that's affecting their ability to be successful. And the person was a little hesitant. The CEO was a little hesitant to do it. And I said, you just need to open the door. Just open the door and let them know that you're concerned. Because you clearly are, you notice where the performance is. And it's something as simple as, Angie, I continue to notice that we're having to have these reports redone. Is there something that's going on? Do I need to know about something? I don't want to put pressure on you, but my door is always open if you ever need to talk. And what happened, this CEO that was a bit of a skeptic as it relates to this, Gloria, once the CEO opened the door slightly, Gloria stepped right in to share what was going on in her life. And that started to address where the problems were stemming from, right? So she didn't have essentially work problems. They were performance problems, but the problems came from home. And so I said, well, let's check her car at home. Competence. Let's check her car. Is she competent? Is she autonomous? And does she have relatedness at home? And what we discovered in the situation was that her live-at-home daughter was pregnant. And so some might argue that that was challenging some of her senses of competency as a mother. Her relatedness was a little bit compromised. She was at odds with her husband. They couldn't agree. They had a lot of conflict. Right. And think about this stuff. We've all lived these things in our lives.
Considering divorce. Right?
Yeah. Like, and you live in that fog, you live in that funk, and then you bring it to the workplace and you try your best, but you have other things you need to tend to, right?
You're not sleeping, you're not eating, like you're having physiological things that are happening, even though you think you're good at it. You're probably not as good as you think you are. And if you were to ask the people you work with, they would probably have a different opinion.
Yeah. And there's downstream effects of that, right?
Yeah.
Your mood, your attitude, your emotions are then, people pick those things up and integrate them into their workday. So then the last thing was autonomy. Well, how was she in autonomy? And what we learned was not only was her high school daughter pregnant and having conflict with her husband, significant conflict, her mother-in-law was moving in. And so that could be argued to erode a level of autonomy there, independence in her own home. And so whether or not you subscribe to this car concept and think it works for this situation or not, that's up to you to decide. We like it as a model. It gives us a framework to understand how people behave. And it's all research based, so we have that foundation component to it, knowing how to draw on that. But I guess the greater request here is let's park junk food motivation in the lane it belongs in, maybe call them preferences or styles or even values. And let's be a little bit more serious about what we mean by motivation and look at people's needs
you're like
more.
seriously in this.
Because if I'm a supervisor and I'm concerned,
but it's weird in a short period of time when you start taking some
I need
stuff.
to be concerned about what's going
I'm
on
like,
in their
I
life.
swear my stomach's
And it's not prying, it's not overstepping. It's just being aware that when someone passes through that front door or logs in through the Zoom account, it doesn't mean everything else in their life doesn't matter.
And I know there's some skeptics out there going, well, their personal life is not my problem. What do you have to say to that?
To the household to have
You know,
set, but they still have
I'm going to try to answer it a different way. We often run into people that say, I treat everyone the same on the staff, and that's how I lead. And the challenge is what exactly do you mean by that? Like, do you honestly know who all your people are and treat them according to who they are? Or are you not knowing them and just treating them all the same? And it's usually the latter, right? Because if you actually know someone, you know that they have certain behavioral tendencies, they have different communication preferences,
that is
they have all these different things that make up who they
I
are.
need to mute somebody here.
And so we need to respect and handle people according to who they are if we really want to cultivate a workplace that fuels their spirit and not drain it. And people really do feel the difference. That's why we go into organizations and work with the training and develop academies and things like that. It has a downriver effect on the rest of the staff in terms of engagement, in terms of feeling recognized. It elevates levels of trust, right? So when I know that my supervisor knows me for who I am, I'm more likely to be able to engage with them and ask for what I need as an employee. And so the one size fits all approach, it has its place and it has its relative depth, but we want to treat people consistently and fairly, but we want to treat people according to who they are and engage them so that they can be the best version of themselves at work.
Can everybody hear us? Somebody put on here some, just making sure. All right.
They get muted?
Yeah, I think so. We're good. Okay.
All right. Thank you. So any questions, any thoughts? Like, does this make sense? If we could see a yes or a no, I know it's a 20-minute crash course in concept and content that can be blown out to several weeks of content.
Mm-hmm.
I actually do a course. I do a 16-week, do a 6-week, I do an 8-week course on motivation and theories of motivation, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But does it help people understand a little bit more about themselves? Because I know for myself, when I learned about this became a really valuable tool to help me self-monitor and determine where I need more assistance. Do I need more connection, autonomy, or relatedness in my home life? Or do I need more in my work life? And what we know according to the research is that well-being, if you want well-being at home and work, it has to start from home because the research is demonstrating that it flows into work. It doesn't mean you necessarily find well-being at work, but it's the direction well-being occurs is that if you can manage it and have it occur at home, it's easier to have it in the workplace. But the research also shows, and it's not conclusive, but it also shows that you can't have that well-being at work and then have it flow to home. It doesn't occur that way.
Interesting. So I think of it as leading yourself, being as a tool where you can kind of figure out what your needs are and have your needs met. And then also just asking more questions, because we really do kind of jump to judgment just out of habit, and it's easier and it takes less time to just judge people and slap a label on them as incompetent, lazy, not motivated, all the things that make us not have to work. And the reality is we have to actually then stop and ask more questions and find out what's going on. And maybe they are needing some relatedness. Maybe something's shifted so much at home that now they do need you at work. They need some people. And so it's just a tool to help you to pause and to see what those needs are. I do have a question here.
I do see it there.
Yeah.
And I do want to make mention before we get into Whitney's question, is that we are complex people. Like, we have emotions that are occurring constantly, and they can derail us at any point, right? So our ability even to manage our own self isn't awesome, right? Let alone managing a team of 20, 50, 100, right? And all of those things are variables, such as emotion, such as competence, such as autonomy, such as relatedness. Those are all variables that are in flux at all points in the day. And so someone could walk in with feeling great and then by lunch be just devastated because of something going on, whether that's at work or home. And it just affects all these other things. And then it has a emotion contagion effect, or has the possibility of it to affect others.
Yeah.
But I think there's a great question about accountability. And it says, touched on accountability. Would you be willing to expand on how to provide positive accountability? So from our experience, and I think you would agree, is that accountability and the concept of feedback are the two most significant things that are occurring in organizations that lead to outcomes that are not desired, whether that's performance, behavioral, things like that. And what we know is that people want to know how they're doing. People want to be told whether or not, I think about Office Space and the TPS reports and how you stack it. Like, people want to know when they're making mistakes, because if they don't know, how do they ever fix it? And it's not fair to stack on criticism, say at an annual evaluation or some other point, because they never addressed the issue that they didn't know was occurring. And in many instances, people are looking for accountability. People are very much like children in the sense of they need structure and they want structure. Structure gives people the ability to understand where the parameters are of both written and unwritten rules and standards. And so accountability is a big piece of this. And what happens when we don't give accountability and other people notice, we cut our legs out from under us and we erode our views of competence. So if I was the boss and Angie worked for me and she was coming in late and everyone else knew this and I hadn't held her accountable for these actions, people would be taking notes and going, Rob doesn't really have that much of a backbone to hold her accountable. And what makes it even worse, and I know everyone in this talk right now has been in this room, in this experience, we call a big staff meeting and 45 people are in here and I go on to say, work starts at 9, not 9:15, when everyone's there on time except for Angie. And Angie's wondering, I wonder who he's talking about, because I'd never confronted her on it.
Clueless.
Right. And everyone else was like, geez, why hasn't he handled this yet? This is killing us. It erodes the morale. And so the answer for accountability is to do it through compassion. And what happens, we have another model we'll talk about on a different day, the role culture plays in buying you time, space, and grace to have difficult conversations. If you have a negative or a toxic culture, those accountability conversations are always going to be tough. Even though the people want to know on the other end that they're not doing something correctly, but when you have a beautiful culture where people are supportive, people hold each other accountable, peer-to-peer accountability, things like that, you can have those difficult conversations with the people to explain how their performance isn't where it needs to be, or how their behavior, it's usually a behavioral item, isn't where we need it for the team. And the thing is that most people want to be held accountable. It's going to sting. It always stings.
And they might not respond at first, but generally a day or two later, after those initial emotions wear off, they generally come back and say, I thank you. I needed to hear that. And they'd rather you talk to them about their performance issue or their behavioral issue than talk about them, because that isn't loving, it's not kind, and it always gets back to them. And then you cut your legs out from under you again. Whenever your staff knows that you talk about them and you don't talk directly to them, you cut your own legs out and people know that you'll do that to them. And so you erode trust. There's another question.
And we'll get to that in a minute. And you cannot tell me that you have an awesome, vibrant culture if that accountability piece is missing. You could tell yourself that. You could tell your board members that. You could tell whomever you want. But if the accountability and feedback piece isn't truly baked in, really at a compassionate level, you're not where you need to be as an organization. And so you need to spend more time in that authenticity and compassion space, because that is what's going to pull you through in the long run. And it's okay to trip up when you have a difficult conversation. I recommend scripting your notes. And I come in and talk with Angie and say, I'm going to give you some feedback. And I have it written down because I want to make sure I hit all of it. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, right? Because I'm trying to make it I'm not trying to put her on the offense. It's about making enhancements, improvements, because there's an element of like love for another human to be cared for and taken care of. And so, and I might even trip over some of this. So this is hard for me because this is constructive and critical. And I probably should have started this about a year ago, right? Because a lot of the other questions are, well, I haven't done it yet. How do I start? And there's no better time than now. but there has to be an element of compassion and connectedness that truly brings you through this, right? And if you don't have that, there still is no better time than now, because you need to do the right thing, but it's just going to be a bigger thing to chew.
And it's hard at first, just like any new skill. And so scripting it out is a good one. We have one question from Katie that says, this model looks like a great kickoff, feels like a great kickoff point, simple to remember, great for newly appointed leaders. Any tips for finding the autonomy sweet spot?
Yeah, so I think of autonomy like a rubber band, and we always want to keep some tension on that rubber band. And if whatever way you want to look at it, you give too much autonomy, the band falls. You diminish it or you micromanage too much, and it breaks too much for a person. And so what is that appropriate level to think about in terms of granting autonomy? There's this concept I talk about at times. It's called challenge and support. It's not my concept, it's someone else's. But the idea there is that you're giving people challenging tasks, just challenging enough that it's fun for them. You ever heard of flow? The concept of being in flow, you're immersed, time doesn't matter. So it's finding that spot where, and we're not saying everyone's going to be in flow when you delegate something to them. But my point is that there's that sweet spot where people are like, this is fun, this is new, this is different. Like if you want to talk about strengths in that environment, that's a perfect spot to have a conversation about strengths. And it's just enough to get them going, but I'm also following behind them close enough to help them pick things up at times. And with your new people that have that no competence, they might only have their craft competence, but they're new to the organization. The autonomy is pretty low at that point, and there's a lot more hand-holding. Even though you might be an expert in something, it's accounting or sales. You don't know how we do it here. So there's some hand-holding that occurs. So the answer for autonomy is highly related to the answer to their status in terms of competence. And this is where we talk about thinking of competence not in terms of the entire job, but the task. And so if we manage according to task, Angie might be super competent at one thing that I give her all the autonomy she needs and just say, hey, my door's open, come stop in if you need anything, if you need more funding, whatever's in your way, let me know. But she might have an area where she's a lot lower. Let's use myself as an example, that budget example, not competent in that as a leader role. Like I do it, I work with the CFO and stuff like that. That's why I work with them. But if I had to do it myself, the CFO would really realistically and appropriately come in and say, let me handhold you through these sheets we use here, these documents, the process, the spreadsheets, things like that, until I can demonstrate competence to be cut loose. Right? I think sales is probably one of the best industries that does this, where they often, you're going to be attached to me for the next 2 weeks, and you're going to watch me sell according to our company's model. And then 2 weeks after that, we're still tied together, but you're going to take as many as you feel confident in, and I'm going to give you some feedback on that. Eventually, you're going to be fully competent and independent. And so, like I said, I think about the two different things, or let's say three. So the relationship to competence demonstrates where you need to be with autonomy. The nature of that rubber band and that concept of challenge and support. And if you take a leadership perspective in terms of challenge and support, and if you've learned nothing else today and you really live up to that, I'm going to challenge people as far enough as it's a challenge, it's fun, it's a little bit uncomfortable for them, but I'm giving them hey, you got this, I know you've done it, this last project, you nailed it. This is a little bit more. You'll be in a great spot. If you have no other leadership frameworks other than challenge and support, I think you'll be light years ahead of a lot of other people.
One other thing that it comes to mind is that I think oftentimes people don't want to admit that they might not be competent in something, especially when they report to you. So they probably oftentimes have a fear of sharing that. And so it's to be mindful of that. And then also to understand that one way to do it would be to like walk them through their job description, and maybe there's 15 tasks or 20 tasks under their job. Have them rate them in order of what they like to do the best or what they feel most competent at, and also having these conversations more consistently will make it easier for them to start to share and be vulnerable about, yeah, I'm not as good at that, because in their interview they told you that they were good at everything, right? Because that's what they needed to get the job. But realistically, oftentimes Rob has a blog on this about how our job description looks like a Sears catalog wish book list. And we do think we're going to get somebody that has all of these things, somebody super compliant, but then we want them to be giving them presentations and be outgoing and good with people. And oftentimes we just set people up for failure because we think we can get one person to do all of these things well, and that's really unrealistic.
Yeah.
And so sometimes our job descriptions, they're not written right in the first place. And then when we ask them to be real honest with us and rate them in order, that'll help us to find out where they're struggling. Do they need training? Do they need to follow somebody? What can you do to help them become more competent? And just say, what can I do to boost your level of competency in budgets? Or what can I do to boost your level of competency in public speaking because you're working for a chamber? Or what can I do to boost your level of just understanding the culture? Like, who can I have you follow? I'm going to put you with, would you like a mentor? Like, what would you need? And that is just walking them through that and being like, I know you're not really good at it. And even sharing what you're not that great at. Being vulnerable. That's another one of our tenets at Black River, is that vulnerability does not equal weakness. In fact, it's actually needed for trust and for building connection. So if you're not willing to be vulnerable and you are the one with all the answers and you never share the things that that you struggled with or that you did. One of my mentors is on here right now, and I do remember thinking she had it all figured out and she was good at this from the day she started. And I remember her sharing with me, wasn't good at public speaking either. I wasn't good at this. Like I didn't just wake up perfect. She had to go through all of those processes. And what I learned is, wow, she was insecure too at this point in her career. And if you share those kind of experiences with them, they start to realize, oh, wow, they do care about me. They are interested in my success. They didn't have it all figured out. Pretty soon you start to build trust, and then they'll say, yeah, I'm not very good at this. I could probably use some training, or I could use a mentor in this area.
Wonderful. I do see a question there. Gregory, you're correct. Competence is C, autonomy is A, R is relatedness. Yeah. But I do want to bring it a little bit more full circle, because we talked about not treating everyone the same and being superficial. It's knowing people and creating those relationships that helps overcome exactly what you were talking about, is that insecurity, that fear, right? Why would I ask my boss a question when he or she just hired me and I'm going to look like I don't know what I'm doing? We put tremendous pressure on ourselves. And if you just spoke with that person, and we know this because we talked to them about this, they say, yeah, I had the same problems, just like your story about who you're talking about, right? And so it's a very true and real thing. And it all comes back to this connection, this compassion, this supportive environment, which is very dynamic. And we're starting with leaders here, but you want to take the next level on this. Think about your reports. One of the things we're concerned with is, how do we help your direct reports advocate for themselves and ask for what they need, right? You want to make your job even easier. And not only you learn about this across the executive or the leadership group, but you build competency and power and empower your people with similar knowledge so that they can start saying, Angie, I need a little bit more assistance with this, or even the concept of psychological safety. They feel comfortable to say, I don't see it the same way. Can I share my idea instead? And you're like, yeah, that's great. Thank you. Right? So all these things go together. And when they're going well, they create beautiful things in organizations. I love watching the leaders step out and the staff hold each other accountable, things like that.
Yeah, that's when your culture's good. When your team is holding each other accountable, it makes less work for you. And it's just a great culture. We have a couple more questions that we want to get through here. So Eileen, I sometimes ask people how much autonomy they like. And if I were to address something with them, how do they like these conversations to flow? Opens the door if you ever need it. Then you respectfully address it according to what they told you. I love that.
Yeah, love that concept. We actually are seeing more and more of this with our clients that are using some of our personality or behavioral or communication assessments, that they're using those as the tool to help facilitate those conversations. So it becomes really easy that someone can look at their preferences, styles, interests, things like that. You notice I didn't say motives. and we work to meet them where they're at.
Mhm.
You know, the last thing I do want to leave, because we're getting close to an hour and I talk way more than I'd wanted, is that just as you have this vibe and this culture is going awesome, one bad hire can change that. And I think we all know that. And sometimes we wrestle with that. We're like, well, things have been really good. Why aren't they good anymore? And if we're not careful, and it has an implication for improved quality of screening, but also improved quality of onboarding, as well as getting back to Whitney's question on accountability, quickly holding people accountable and providing drips of feedback at a regular occurrence, so that when you have to provide something a little bit more monumental, it doesn't sting as much. So we thank you for being here today. If you look at can we put the model back up again real quick? We have an email right on the bottom of that, info@blackriver.com. If you have any questions, send us your thoughts, your comments. We will post this as a recording, so share it with friends.
I'm actually going to send it out in this month's newsletter. I waited to do the newsletter until we had this recording. So I'd love it if you shared with others, because I think it's a very helpful tool. Many people are in leadership roles with no leadership frameworks to get them understanding what's going on. And we need more compassionate leaders. We need people who care about people's basic needs and their basic psychological needs. And then once we get past those, we can start looking at their preferences, and we can start to look at really creating a culture where people want to be.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is keep connected with us. Check out our website, information on there. Angie's podcast, One Drop Today with Amy. It was awesome. Check that out. Those come out every 2 weeks. So our goal really is, and my blog, when I get around to writing stuff, it's fun for us, and we love that it actually helps people make enhancements in their life. So
Absolutely.
thank you very much for your time, and keep an eye on LinkedIn and the newsletter, because we will let you know when part 2 is going to be rolled out for another live conversation. And that will be the speedometer section of our model.
Yeah, and we're hoping to do one of these quarterly. This is our kind of give back and get to people to know what we do, and that we believe work should fuel the human spirit, not drain it. And that's what we aim to do. So let us help you if we can. Thank you so much.
Thank you.